Okay, so we have one more indoor presentation, and then we are going to go outside in the sunshine where it's warm. Going to eat more food. It's going to be great. Okay, so this is going to be pretty quick and painless. Normally I do this presentation in the very beginning of a training, but I feel like you all have had a lot of exposure to some of these different topics already based on other people's presentations. So we're going to go kind of quick, and I'm going to get into some more specific stuff that feels relative to you and that was kind of requested when I offered to give this presentation here. So talking about compost feedstocks, feedstock finding. Woody materials are one of your main components of your compost pile. It makes up to 60% of what you have to add in to get your proper recipe for making compost. And these are some really common materials that we collect in most areas. I've been led to understand that sourcing some of these materials in your area can be very challenging for different reasons. But these are some really common materials that most people can find in some quantity to make their compost with. And I have some resources that are a little more specific to you that I'll present in a couple later slides. So wood chips, mushroom substrate, hay and straw, sawdust, and rice hulls, again, in the Central Valley are a really common material. All very high in carbon, woody materials. So the purpose of our feedstock, they serve a lot of different purposes when we're making compost with them. And a lot of these we've already talked about. So again, I'm just going to go through this kind of quickly, and feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask questions. So what do we get from feedstocks? Well, we get structure. A lot of you saw Prima's video on bulk density that we played during Soil Palooza. So the type of materials you use for feedstock are going to create structure for water movement and airspace and microbial activity in your compost pile. Bulky materials are going to open it up. Really fine materials are going to make it more dense, hold moisture in better, but potentially inhibit airflow. We get our microbes from our feedstocks. Again, we already talked about this, but you'd want to get feedstocks that are likely to be rich in microorganisms. So we want to avoid things that have been treated with different types of biocides, because that can also affect your microbial activity. We get nutrients. Our feedstocks are how we feed microbes. We want lots of diversity in that diet. Just like when we have a diverse diet, we're healthier. Same with your microorganisms, and you're going to wake up a lot of different types of microbes that are really going to increase nutrient cycling and the resiliency of your material that you're creating. And moisture, those feedstocks are going to hold moisture, and they do that in different ways. If you've ever tried to soak wood chips with water, you'll notice it takes a lot more time to really penetrate that moisture into them and get them wet, versus when you're using straw or sawdust or something like that. It gets wet very quickly, increased surface area, often less oxygen. So lots of different functions and lots of things to think about when we're selecting our feedstocks for our piles. Compost recipe, I feel like you are probably very familiar with this by now. But just to shine a slightly different light on it, if it's helpful for you. Yeah, we converted from PC to Mac. And Apple products do not like my slides because I use Microsoft. So carbon to nitrogen ratio, your browns, your greens, possibly your manure. We also call this high nitrogen source. They're going to feed different classes of microorganisms, which have different effects on your compost. I've listed out some other really common materials in these different categories. But what I want you to notice is we have this ratio, excuse me, which is 4 parts brown, 3 parts green, and 1 part high nitrogen. So ratios can get really confusing, and we throw a lot of them out there when we're talking about composting. So I just wanted to show you a really simple way to maybe figure this out when you're measuring materials in your compost. And again, stop me if you've already done this. Okay. So we have 4 to 3 to 1. This is usually how ratios are written. And all this means is parts. Parts can be any measurement you want to use. It just has to be the same measurement for each of those numbers. So I like to use 5-gallon buckets. It's something people usually have on hand at your compost site. And it's a really great measuring tool when you're first starting to get a sense of how much of each material to put in. So first of all, we have to know how many total parts do we have to work with. So we have 4 parts plus 3 parts plus 1. So we have 8 total parts, whatever this means, right? So let me pull up this next one because it's going to be helpful. So if we're talking about a cubic yard of compost, which is a pretty common measurement for most people to use, a 3-bin system, one of those bays, if you're using pallets, is typically a cubic yard. So that's going to be this 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot pile. That comes out to 45-gallon buckets. So if we have 8 total parts and we have 45-gallon buckets, we divide that by 8 parts, which gets us 1 part, this generic part that we talk about, equals 5-gallon buckets. So then we take this single part and we just multiply it by this ratio. So 5 times 4, 20 5-gallon buckets of browns, 15 5-gallon buckets of green, and 5. 5-gallon buckets of whatever your high nitrogen source is. It's that simple. The one caveat to this is when you're using a 5-gallon bucket, do not be deceived. We are not necessarily talking about volume. We're talking about weight. So you can use volume, but you'll notice if you fill a 5-gallon bucket with wood chips and fill a 5-gallon bucket with food waste, they don't weigh the same. So if you're going to do it by volume, get your brown material wet first, because that's going to equate, be much more equal to what you're adding in food waste. So wet browns, you can use volume. Dry browns, use weight. So it's going to be slightly different. You'll note a 5-gallon bucket of wood chips is typically around 10 to 12 pounds. 5-gallon bucket of food waste can be around 30. So if you're using weight, just use your scale. Same idea. You can do the bulk density to figure out what the weight of that 1 cubic yard is, and you plug it in here and use weight instead of number of 5-gallon buckets. So I hope that was helpful. If you don't have the high nitrogen on hand, I think that's the recommendation, is to go more 50-50. Typically, you're still going to try to err on the side of more brown material versus green, though. So I'd probably shoot for more of like a 2 or 3 to 1 if you're not using high nitrogen. That's what I do with my compost. I have about 2 to 1 wood chips to food waste.
I mean, it's become a little bit of adventure for us to find a good manure source locally. So we use manure, but it's like we are sprinkling spices on our dish. We are not adding it as part of the dish.
Do you use a lot of post-consumer food?
Yes.
That is high nitrogen. It has been cooked. Those materials have been broken down into a much simpler state, and they will kick off your bacteria like no one's business. I get a lot of rice as post-consumer food waste because of some of the restaurants that I go to, and that is just sugar land for bacteria. It heats up piles very quickly with very little addition.
And did the previous slide say something about stuff from brewing processes?
Yes.
So you can go to small breweries and ask them for their end result stuff, their leftovers.
Yes, spent grain, spent brewing products are incredible high nitrogen sources. So there's seeds. Yes, a much higher expression of using those materials is to feed to animals. So this is a really important slide that kind of addresses what we're talking about when we say brown, green, and high nitrogen, right? All we're doing is thinking about a plant at different phases of its life cycle. And this can be really helpful if you're trying to source carbon materials. If you have access to green plants, if you have the opportunity to let them finish out their life cycle, now you have a brown material. So you can see, this is kind of a really generic list. You can find lists like this all over the internet. There are whole books written on this topic of the C to N ratio of individual materials you can compost with. But what's really interesting about this particular slide is, let's see, we have grass clippings, 9 to 25, pretty high nitrogen, right? Well, what happens when that grass ends its life and becomes straw? Suddenly it's 50 to 150, super high carbon material. So when plants are super new and just sprouting, or they're still in seed form, they are super high nitrogen. They have all these nutrients that they need in their bodies to grow into this big, huge plant. So at the very beginning of a plant's life cycle, or at the end, you know, seed production, that particular piece of the plant is incredibly high nitrogen. So that's where the rice is high nitrogen. Spent brewing grains are high nitrogen. And really early green sprouts from different plants are also going to be very high nitrogen, like bud tips on trees and things like that. Don't harvest your tree buds to put in your compost, though. Yes?
On that same note, are these numbers for like fresh manure or dried manure?
So that's also a very good point. I'm not sure on this particular list. This came from a research paper that actually I have some interesting data from later on in this. I'm going to say probably fresh, but that also might be why there's a range listed. So she brought up a very good point. Brown material does not imply that you have just dried out a green material. They are two different things, and they're going to have different carbon to nitrogen ratios. Some types of nitrogen in plants are volatile, and they will turn into gases and leave your material if it's left to dry out in the sun. Dried green materials, and there's actually a really great example in this. So we have hay, and we have straw. So the difference here, and the reason hay still has a higher nitrogen content in it, is because hay is cut in the middle of its life cycle. Some of it may have gone to seed, but typically hay is still green when it is cut for animals because there's a higher nitrogen and nutrient content in that material. So it's still dried, it's laid out in the field, it becomes dry and they bale it. Straw, on the other hand, is the end product of growing grain crops. So the grain has to be fully and completely mature before they harvest these materials, which means the rest of the plant has ended its life cycle. It's dying. It's ready to release those seeds back into the soil. So different points in its life cycle, even if the material is dried out, it's still going to be a higher nitrogen material. It's why they recommend alfalfa, which is a hay, as a way to heat up your compost piles and add more green material to them. So that's a very good point. Yeah.
For worm bins too, it's actually really great during winter season if you want to keep the bin warm to add grass clippings, because it does get that thermophilic. And also worms will stay away from where it's really hot, but it actually adds an ambient temperature to your bin and keeps the moisture from freezing.
It's like a little heated blanket for your worms. Yeah, so this can get really complex, but just know, like, those young seeds and those super young plants, high nitrogen, midlife, it's going to be a really nice balance, which is right where you want your compost to be at, ideally. And then end of life and those really intense woody materials, that's going to be high carbon.
Janel, does the temperature of that particular specific area will play any role in this carbon-nitrogen ratio mix, or it does not have any impact because our summers are 125, whereas...
So you mean like where the plant is growing in its life? Potentially, if it's growing in a really harsh environment and it's not getting the nutrients that it prefers to survive. But if that plant isn't out of place, it should still be able to accumulate the nutrients it needs to maintain that. But again, like every single individual plant is different, right? Sexual reproduction, causes variation that's natural. So, I mean, this is never a guarantee. You're never going to get a solid number when you ask about the C to N ratio of different materials, even if it's within the exact same plant. You could test the same plant type over and over and over again and get a slightly different number. So, it's really going to depend on the specific plant, but it's just a good starting point. Again, you're going to experiment with your recipes and find something that works for you. It's all experimentation. Feedstock challenges. So this is where I'm hoping to get some feedback from you all and maybe be able to provide some suggestions that might help you. What if you can't source carbon? So this was one of the first things that Haley mentioned to me when we talked about me coming down here to be part of this training, is that sourcing carbon in the desert can be a serious challenge, right? So I know this is a little messed up, but I mean, it doesn't matter. I can still read it. So I came up with some suggestions that might be helpful. So I'm always of the mind to start with prevention in any scenario. So if you can't find carbon, maybe there are other ways that you can compost, right? Maybe there are methods that don't require you going out and having to encounter this struggle at all. Now, I am definitely not an expert in most other methods of composting. I practice thermophilic composting. I have kept some home-scale worm bins where I live, but to my understanding, there are two significant forms of composting that have a much lower demand for carbon, and that's vermicomposting and bokashi. So bokashi is more of a fermentation method of processing food waste. They select for very specific organisms that they call effective microbes. It's a Korean natural farming method. So I know a little bit about it. I'm really not going to speak to this much. There are a lot of resources, even within our CCGS2 cohort, who can probably inform you a lot further on proceeding with this method of composting. But it's a super great way to cut out that need for large amounts of carbon materials. Yay! Along those same lines, vermicomposting, which Courtney could speak to all day. I am not a vermicomposter. I have a little bit of experience with those methods of composting. Obviously, all living things do need carbon to an extent, but it's going to be a much lower demand than what you need for building these big thermophilic compost mounds. So maybe consider different methods of composting. You can scale either of those methods up to whatever size you want. And again, there are people in our cohort who can help advise you if that's something you'd like to do. Outsource materials. So maybe you found these carbon sources, but your own individual needs for carbon are not large enough to compel someone to bring you the huge quantities of these materials they're trying to get rid of. If you're communicating with a farm or a lumber mill, they're going to say, oh, you need 30 gallons of sawdust. I have 4 truckloads I need to get rid of, and they're looking to do all of this in one fell swoop. They don't want to make a bunch of small deliveries. So maybe pooling together, finding a common drop-off site for large amounts of material that then everyone can take from could be a way that you can convince these people to bring you large quantities of materials or find some funding for them to deliver that and satisfy their needs and serve a larger population of community composters as well. I'm thinking like sawdust from sawmills or rice hulls. This is a big material that's available up in my area specifically. Drying plant materials to increase the seed. Oh, go ahead.
So I'm a big fan of trying to figure out what to do with shredded paper. I know we had a discussion about how Palm Springs likes to take care of it, but I generate a ton of shredded paper at home from documents and things. Can you only use shredded paper? Would that still work? Would you have to still add some kind of wood chips?
No.
Or you get away with just using paper?
I'd say the only challenge with using shredded paper, well, there's a couple challenges with it, but you absolutely can use just shredded paper for your carbon source. It's actually listed on here. There's actually a couple paper products. Newspaper. Okay, I guess this one just has newspaper, but super high carbon. So you do have to be careful when using that, keeping that ratio a little more balanced.
I was just curious, what about cardboard? Because it seems like everyone gets everything online nowadays.
Yeah, cardboard is even better because especially corrugated cardboard has that built-in structure to allow more porosity. Mushrooms love cardboard.
If you guys are going to Costco, talk to me. They recognize me as a cardboard girl. So you want to go to the liquor aisle and they take out the first layer of the empty liquor sheets, and there is a sheet of cardboard, corrugated cardboard, every single pallet. While you're going for your grocery, you pick 3 or 4 sheets, 4 by 4 every single time. You have a ton of cardboard on your hand.
Oh, you can find it at Aldi too. I take it from Aldi.
So the challenge is, I would say though, paper tends to mat really heavily, so I would make sure that your system of composting involves a lot of agitation and turning to prevent that from happening. Also, paper products are heavily processed. They probably are not coming into your system with a lot of microbes. So the organisms that are going to break down and feed on woody materials like your fungi, you might not be introducing a lot of those populations into your compost, so you might really want to consider inoculating during your maturing phase or your curing phase to make sure that those populations are present. But yes, you can use just paper.
Janel, this is my last question, I promise, for that slide.
Oh, it's fine.
For paper, I used completely print paper, which is completely bleached and white. Then I picked up our daily newspaper that's black and white, and then I used color paper separately. So I saw this black and white paper is what not been a pain for me, whereas the complete white print paper is a pain. Is it because of the clay content or of the pure white paper?
Like, is it shredded in the shredder?
Yeah.
All of it? Oh.
Yeah, honestly, I can't really speak to that. Newspaper is going to have probably more diverse nutrients in it because they use a soy-based ink in the printing, whereas just a plain white sheet of paper is probably going to be just carbon. So it might take longer to break. You're talking about like it's harder to get it to break down in your compost?
It's harder to get it break down, and it mats really badly.
Yeah.
The printer paper, like the A4 sheet. But with the newspaper, the black and white printed newspaper, it's easier for it to process.
I think newspaper is very thin.
It's more porous, right? It's thinner.
That's
and
what I
it
was
tends to be
thinking.
more porous.
That
Yeah.
white paper gets bleached and has chlorine added to it, which can create a sterile environment that bacteria or stuff doesn't want to be on.
Yeah, and you think about the places that you find newspaper, like people leave those outside on the curb. They're also having a lot more environmental exposure during their lifetime typically. Yeah, versus bleached white paper, it may still have residues of chlorine, which is toxic to microorganisms. But they'll get in there. You just got to give it time. And it's also a lot thicker material. It's going to hold more water and probably mat more. All right, challenges. So drying plant materials. So drying green plant materials can bring up the C to N ratio. It's not going to be a huge significant change, but it can create slightly more carbon-rich materials and bring the nitrogen content down a little bit. Growing materials for your own compost piles. Now, I know growing things in the desert can be challenging, but the entire drive over here yesterday, there was one consistent weed that I saw growing on the side of the road. Anyone want to guess what it was? I'm glad you know your local weeds. Sunflowers. Freaking everywhere. They grow on the side of the road, everywhere across this country. I don't think I've been to a single state that you do not see feral sunflowers growing on the sides of the road. They grow incredibly fast, incredibly large. They don't have super, and at the end of their life cycle, you have this incredible big woody mass that you can chop down and add into your compost. Also, like someone mentioned earlier, if you cut it off at the base and leave the stalk, you're creating habitat for arthropods and insects to live in your garden. You're leaving structure in the soil with the roots. Sunflowers are notorious for pulling different pollutants out of the soil, and by composting that material, you can potentially help to permanently bind up some of these things that you don't want to be persistent pollutants. Super great material. If you want a longer-term solution.
Do you have any thoughts on moringa? Because especially for Coachella Valley, UCR has a small group of people who are just focusing on moringa because you can just chop it and next year it's going heavily back again. So that's my main source of carbon in my yard right now. It's like moringa, that's it.
Yes, moringa, willow, paulownia trees, all of these trees have incredibly rapid rates of growth and can be harvested for woody material constantly. So there's a technique, and I honestly have no idea who developed it. We have a tree person who would talk to you all day about this, but coppicing is a practice that indigenous cultures have practiced for millennia, and it is the process of cutting back these fast-growing woody trees to let them regrow for different reasons. Indigenous folks in my area do this to willow trees to get these nice long shoots that they can harvest for basketry. But these materials can be constantly harvested as long as these plants are being cared for and create carbon-rich materials on your compost sites, or if you find common space where you can grow things if you can't grow at your compost site. Maybe that's an effort you could contribute to get materials for your compost. So yes, moringa is one of them. Paulownia trees are super great. Also deciduous trees, because they're going to drop all those leaves at certain times of year. That's a great material you can collect. So another material I understand that you have a lot of is palm, which anyone who's handled these materials knows that they will slice you open, they don't break down, they're sticky, they're hard to cut apart. Materials like this, I would suggest going the route that Daniel's been talking about and turn it into biochar. Biochar is pure carbon. Now, I don't know if I would recommend building an entire compost pile out of this, because I've added charcoal to my compost piles before and it will skyrocket your temperature. But 10 to 12% addition of biochar to compost piles not only adds in that carbon that you may be lacking and creates this perfect environment for microbes, you're putting housing in for the microbes for when that compost goes into the soil, you're creating water retention for your compost. And also, when you turn this into biochar and add it into your piles, carbon has an incredible ability to attach to any of these volatile materials that are going to off-gas out of your piles. So it keeps smells down. If you haven't quite got your recipe right and you get anaerobic pockets, it can prevent all of those scents from leaving your piles and attracting animals. So.
Okay.
So I don't know what biochar is. I don't know how you make it or where you get it.
We're going to do it. Daniel is the biochar master, and he will talk all about it. But burning these materials can be potentially a solution to create more carbon-rich materials and add that into your piles. Oh, and I already read my last one because I'm on a roll. So does anybody else have questions about or challenges?
I mean, I have this question probably for you and Daniel.
And Wendy, you and I are going to try and memorize these answers to bring back to Prescott Preserve.
So we've got a 120-acre ex-golf course. You can imagine everything that's happened to that land. It's now a nature preserve, and we just started a compost site here on Monday, which was like a massive push for the last couple of years. And when we're thinking about like what do they have in abundance across this property, not only do they have a bunch of invasives, but they have just buco amounts of palm. When you're imagining, and Daniel, you're imagining how to not only build the soil structure, but to remediate some of the chemicals and the pesticides and things like that that use 120 acres of land, 10% of biochar. I mean, what are we talking about? When you want to bring in like the big people that know how to do this, constructive burn piles, and who is doing this on a scale that we can talk about, where the community members can start to understand why there's smoke over in the pocket of their neighborhood.
So actually what we're going to show you today is actually how to make a smokeless fire, basically.
Okay.
So you can burn a giant pile, and it's proven to be at least 85% reduction in pollution on a large scale. So it's pretty much no smoke, which is really cool. And all that palm is great feedstock for sure. So we can convert a lot of the material that's present into high quality carbon and incorporate that in the soil. And like they were talking about moringa, sunflowers, etc. Start planting these plants all around and continue, upping your feedstock so that we can keep making more carbon down the road. And again, you won't have to notify your neighbors about smoke because we'll be doing it the healthy way.
All right, good. So that part's answered. So are we just doing the top 1%? Are we doing the roof with biochar? I mean, where do we start to? That was actually the living room, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, so you can you could totally put it in your compost. So when you're applying your compost, it gets out there. Incorporate it whenever you're planting. A little bit. You don't have to do every square foot of that acreage. Okay. Just think about really primarily focusing on including in your compost, including in your planting sites, and then slowly but surely. Nature you're creating opportunistic situations where the life is, and then they'll expand outward. It's like you're basically creating a bunch of oases. So just keep focus on making those oasis types of locations, and if you make them strong and resilient, they'll expand and then they'll connect, and then the whole space will start.
Right. I'm so grateful for what you're talking about, because not only have they started to plant trees on the preserve, but the trees have been dying because the soil is so unhealthy. You plunk a bunch of native plants and trees, but they're just like, nope, not going to do it. They're getting beetles and borers and all of these things. So
it's a combination. I mean, a huge portion of trees not only were already there, but they were donated by.
Right, so they showed up in rough shape. But I'm just thinking from like what do we bring back to these projects who are?
Of the 100 that were planted, they only lost 4. So the ones that died were the ones in pots.
So not too bad. I was just looking at the sick ones the other day.
Yeah, they were the ones in pots that were
I'm just
really,
thinking of this more on a meta as we're talking about how to do this.
And I'm more.
I mean,
so why do you think there's no commercial biochar generating?
There is.
There are.
Yeah. There's a company I work with that actually converts a lot of ag waste into electricity and biochar.
Sorry.
So it's pretty cool. They actually were doing experiments with human waste as well. But it was too wet, and the people who processed it didn't want to. Yeah, they didn't want to dry it out. So it is being done. It's just still kind of expensive, and there's just not a lot of people that want to spend that kind of money. But I think our government should be offsetting that cost. They should be subsidizing it to ensure that we can make clean energy and convert our waste into something that solves our drought and cleans our soils, because we're talking about ensuring the future of agriculture, which is how we make money in California for the most part and how we survive and thrive. And then another thing to the whole planting the trees, I feel like a lot of tree planting projects are so focused on planting trees in terms of quantity, but not quality. And so my thing is, I'd rather invest 5-10 times as much on one tree and make sure it's grown correctly and it actually thrives and creates that oasis effect, rather than trying to be like, oh, we planted 1 million trees, but then half of them die. And then the other half get the beetles, and then just they don't create that oasis effect. And then down the road, you wasted all that money and time, and then we're like over here scratching our heads, what did we do wrong?
And
So
you dampened everyone's spirits because they were excited, and then when they come back to be excited, then when everything's dead, they're like, clearly, whatever you're doing is not working.
Because those trees were just donated by a grower, they were not necessarily selected for the location of the purpose. It's like, we have all these trees, we'll give them to you for free.
yeah,
And then they write it off on the taxes.
and Calscape is great too. It's a great website if anyone wants to check it out. It just shows you a bunch of local plants that do well in your region. Of course, invest into your soil. Make sure that you treat them right. And there's certain. I'll show you guys some in a little bit. We can talk about some more things that we can incorporate to make them more likely to succeed. But sorry, Courtney's got a question.
No, more of a comment. There's a similar program going on in California right now run by CAL FIRE. And it's where they're taking a lot of the woody biomass from clearing defensible space and also down trees and forestry products that are just like already contaminated, and they're making biochar with it, and they are trying to get it out into the agricultural industry. Where they have connected with us is folks that are running larger windrow style composting. So this probably wouldn't work really in a smart stack or a 3-bin method. But if you're doing large scale windrows, is to add like kind of a 3 to 10 inch layer on the base of where you put these windrows to suck up lechet and any additional water that's produced during the compost process, or like a very spice sprinkling of it into your compost pile. So there's an opportunity if you want to bring it above board and also get the residents in Prescott Preserve involved in this, is to do it in conjunction with CAL FIRE. Because then you'll just build trust and confidence. It's already a program that's being funded. Potentially it's work in hours you could get extra compensation for through an entirely different program. So CAL FIRE is already kind of working with stations like that.
So I'm curious because you know how when we get the Dave Grove fires out in the East Valley and they're very smoky because of the high moisture content that the palm trees hold. So I think we'd have to have the ability to let it rest and dry out a little bit before creating biochar.
Yeah,
I'm just even though you have a smokeless method, I mean, if you're trying to burn something that's really wet.
Wait, yeah, part of the method is making sure that everything's thoroughly dry.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
And I have a single more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, we are in Coachella Valley, right? Which means we have a ton of ag land and we have a ton of golf courses and we have inevitable Bermuda grass that doesn't want to leave our ads. When I started learning about regenerative agriculture, how tilling is bad and everything, I tried to put a shovel into my ad, where is Bermuda grass, felt like I'm a superwoman and I can dig it up. 4 feet down, I can still see roots.
Wow.
6 feet down, I can still see Bermuda grass thriving in the compacted sand/dirt. So I don't want to go in trying to take out Bermuda grass by excavating and thinking that, okay, I got rid of it.
Right.
So in conjunction with doing this biochar at this particular project, they have 120 acres of Bermuda grass.
Oh, right.
It's not just solving one issue. We are like 120 acres of Bermuda grass, number of palm trees that haven't taken care for a long time, and now the city wants them to take care of it. And at the same time, it's a natural preserve, nature preserve. So they don't want to introduce many, outside things or anything. And my question is, since with the climate change, our temperature is rising, where do we draw the line that what used to be a native species might or might not be native anymore? Do we have any research or any documentation going on that?
There is a lot. That is a whole different conversation called assisted migration. It's something that is a very hot ticket item in the world of tree planting and seed collecting and seed saving with a lot of different groups. And Dominic, who is our tree guy, would speak to you at length about this, I'm sure. And there's also a lot of information, but I have 5 minutes left, and that is a whole nother conversation about succession and
Oh, I just wanted to point out, because with the biochar, I have a big, kind of know. But the first thing that came up was from the USDA, and they have all kinds of resources on biochar. And I just kind of want, for me, because I teach agriculture, right? And my whole goal is to change some of the mistakes we've made by changing the whole thought process and the training and the learning. So I really don't want people to think that, oh, agriculture hasn't looked into this, or how come our government isn't doing anything about it? It's like, they are the experts here. Agriculture is the #1 employer for research. They have information, so be sure and check your USDA. There's the site that's SARES, which is Sustainable Agricultural Research, run by the United States Department of Agriculture. So, please don't, agriculture is not a bad word.
No.
Without it, we'd not be here. We just, as humans, we always know if something's really good, we gotta do it even more, We don't really, we make the mistakes and then have to go back, but luckily, we are intelligent enough as the premier species, or top species, can figure out these problems, And I think we just need to focus not on what happened and how come and why, and be angry about it. Just know that, just own it and know that we're here and we can fix these things. Little steps at a time, and helping each other out, and educating ourselves, each other, and it's got to move this big, huge thing, back. So please don't throw away those resources that are right there, that have a lot of backing. There's a lot of funding, especially for sustainable ag. It's really becoming, they know it's a crisis. They know that something has to be done. They're the ones out there and having to deal with it.
And you're out there having to deal with it. You're teaching the next generation, and I thank you for bringing that into the room. And we're not trying to turn a speedboat around, we're trying to turn a barge. And that barge needs to look like all of us. So thankfully, with the connections of our community composting band of renegades, we have a movie that is on the menu if y'all want it, but when Mamie brought this to my attention earlier, I was like, oh, it's so fitting, because the name of this movie that we have the license to, thankfully, is called Common Ground. And it is about finding that and pulling those resources together. And nobody in this room is trying to demonize but I share that. Like, okay, so how are we gonna take the barge and move together? And if you want to join us for that movie tonight, if we're not totally stuffed from the 3 gigantic meals we're all gonna have today, then maybe we can just hang out in the lounge of the dorm room and watch that movie together.
Popcorn.
We're gonna try to make that happen. And this movie is out in the theaters right now, so the fact that we even have a license for it is really special. So please consider
It's the sequel to Kiss the Ground movie. Have you seen Kiss the Ground? It's the same directors, and they created a second movie called Common Ground. It's pretty awesome. Aquaman. That's an answer right there. I might have lost you.
I couldn't handle it. Yeah, and just on that note as well, I mean, a lot of the ways of farming that we have today have been passed down through generations. It's what people have been taught since they were young. So it's the way they know to do it, and it's the way that currently has been working for them. And as more and more farmers start to realize that these processes are no longer working, there are some really incredible large-scale transitions that are happening, and it is beautiful. So yes, I grew up on a farm. Agriculture has been my whole life. And, seeing the fear in some of these people at the suggestion of having to change their entire program and not knowing if it's going to work, and this is how they feed their families, like, we have to take these things into consideration. So I came up with a list, just on a Google search, of some potential places that you can get carbon locally. There are a boatload of horse stables in this area. There were at least 10 that came up immediately with a single search all around Redlands. Bedding material that they use for horses can be a really great carbon source. You will get some horse manure. Horse manure is actually pretty high in carbon as far as manures go, so not a bad thing. Lumber mills, huge grain of salt here, big asterisk. If it's coming from a place where they are milling timber, you're probably safe. If this is coming from somewhere that does custom milling, where they're making cabinets or doors or decorative wooden stuff for inside your house, make sure they are not milling particle board, OSB, anything that may have some really gnarly adhesives in it. You do not want those in your compost. I have a fun story about that, actually. But pet stores that sell small furry animals have cages full of wood chips that they empty probably at least once a day. And I don't even know that I've ever gone to one to see what they do with those, but they're probably putting it in the trash. That's also going to come with some nice feces and things like that, also great for the compost pile. Yeah, and then mushroom growers, which Haley mentioned, already having a relationship with some folks that are growing mushrooms. That spent substrate and the mycelium can be really high in carbon, also a good carbon source. They use hardwood sawdust blocks in growing a lot of gourmet mushrooms that people eat. So these will all be available to you later too. I want to get a move on and finish this. So carbon to nitrogen ratio, we've beat the crap out of this topic. You'll notice some things that happen if you have too much of either of these things. Too much carbon, fluffy, cold, dry, typically. Too much nitrogen, dense, slow breakdown, also cold, probably smelly. Structure, again, you can't read these slides, but these are some structural challenges that you may have in your compost pile with your feedstocks. Dense, clumpy, matted, like the paper we were talking about. Fluffy and dry, that might be your palm, that might be wood chips and straw. Large particles, so when you get food waste, like whole potatoes. How many people here have planted their community with the potatoes that still live on in their compost? Anybody? Yeah, yeah. I used to make jokes that I was selling potatoes, not compost. Never-ending supply. So some solutions to those problems. These last couple slides were just like problems and solutions. Solutions to dense wet, add lots of aeration tubes, turn it often, have a forced air system. Fluffy dry materials, pre-soak them. That'll also get you your weight so you have a proper ratio when you're measuring. Add sprinkler systems. Also with fluffy dry materials, create systems that you can cover. ASP systems, you can get Gore-Tex tarps that help hold moisture in so you're not constantly using water. Thermal composting can be very demanding when it comes to water, and in a dry climate like this, even more so. Also, putting your compost in a cool area, putting it down into the ground. If you have sandy soils, you're going to have good drainage already. It's not like in these areas with compacted clay where you're getting a bunch of leachate runoff on the surface. If you have plants growing around your compost, they're going to use those materials so they're not sinking down into your groundwater. Yeah, so inserting worm bins and things like that into the ground. The worms aren't going to leave, and if they do, they're going to come back because you have the food. In a lot of these places, there's nothing else for them, and there's nowhere else for them to go. Free-range worm bins, I'm a big fan. For large particles, pre-chop, shred, or smash. These are some really fun tools that you can use. Only one of these, two of these actually use electricity, and on a small scale, they are great ways to shred and chop your food waste materials before you put them into the compost. This one being my favorite, and someday I will design a system where we have little worm bins that attach to the bottom of your food incinerator in your sink. So you get the water, you get the food, it drains out into gray water, you have all that worm juice in it. Yeah, that's my dream. If you know any plumber/engineers. And then this, what's that?
Hook up a solar panel on your set.
Yeah. And then this one in the top, this bicycle-powered grinder, I'm in love with. And if, again, anyone knows an engineer who wants to build us some little kits, I would be forever grateful. Biocides, we talked about this a little bit. We get them in all shapes and forms in all sorts of the materials we use for composting. I would suggest, if possible, create relationships with the people you get materials from so you know what practices they're using. We can't always do that, especially if you're doing pickups and stuff. You have a lot of customers maybe, or a lot of people you interact with. Maybe you can't know them all that well, but definitely ask questions. Don't be afraid to tell people no.